There are questions that a place will not answer. Not because the answer has been lost to time, but because someone spent a very long time working very hard to ensure it would never be found. If you have ever driven through the South Carolina low country on a still afternoon, when light filters through the live oaks at that precise angle that makes the world look like it is unfolding inside a painting, you already know the feeling. There is a beauty to that land that borders on unbearable. And beneath it, if you know where to look, there is something else entirely. A weight, a density, the particular heaviness of ground that has taken in more history than it was ever built to hold. Somewhere along a stretch of that low country, on a piece of land that no longer appears under any name on any public map, there once stood a plantation. It was not the largest plantation in the county. It was not the most prosperous one. It was not, by any measure its neighbors might have applied, a particularly remarkable place. The main house was handsome, but not grand. The fields were productive, but not exceptional. The man who ran it was capable, methodical, and not given to the kind of excess that draws attention to itself. But there was one thing about that plantation. One single, specific, undeniable thing that no one who ever worked there, lived there, visited there, or passed through there could entirely explain away. One of the cabins was never left unguarded. Not during planting season, when every able body was needed in the fields from first light to last. Not during the dead weeks of January, when the cold came off the river and settled into the bones of the land, and there was nothing to protect, nothing to steal, nothing that any reasonable person would want to stand outside in the dark watching over. Not during the chaos of the war that eventually tore the country apart and sent men running in every direction. Not during the floods of 1852, when the lower fields went underwater and the whole plantation existed in a state of controlled emergency. Day and night, rain and drought, peace and crisis, someone was always at that door. The overseers changed, the seasons changed. The ownership of the land itself passed between hands twice before it was all over. But the guard at the last cabin in the row, the one set slightly apart from the others, closer to the tree line, with the crooked door and the oilcloth window, that guard never stopped. For nearly 40 years, not a single night passed without someone standing watch at that door. No one who worked that land was ever told why, and the few who asked did not ask again. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome to the channel. What you are about to hear is not a ghost story. It is not a legend. It is not the kind of tale that gets told around a fire to frighten children. It is something far more unsettling than any of those things. It is the story of what human beings are capable of when they believe no one is watching, and what happens when, after nearly 4 decades, someone finally does. Stay with us, because the story of Heron's Bluff Plantation and the secret kept inside that cabin for 37 years is one of the most disturbing things we have ever uncovered on this channel, and we are only just beginning. To understand what happened at Heron's Bluff, you have to understand the world it existed inside. Not in the abstract, not in the way that history books describe it from a comfortable distance, but in the specific, granular, day-to-day texture of what it meant to live in the South Carolina Low Country in the years between 1820 and 1860. Because that world, its rules, its silences, its elaborate systems of concealment, is what made the secret of Heron's Bluff possible. More than possible. It made it almost inevitable. South Carolina in 1825 was a place of extraordinary and terrible contradictions. The landscape itself was breathtaking. Wide rivers the color of pewter, in the early morning light, live oaks so old and so massive that their branches reached overhead and turned the roads beneath them into green tunnels, fields of cotton stretching to the horizon like a white sea frozen mid-wave. The air in summer thick with the smell of earth and heat, and the particular sweetness of things growing in soil that had been worked for generations. It was a land that could make you believe, if you were not paying attention, that beauty and goodness were the same thing. They were not. By 1825, South Carolina had more enslaved people than free white citizens. The economy of the entire state, its roads, its ports, its grand houses, its political influence in Washington, the very food on the tables of its most prominent families, rested entirely on the labor of men, women, and children who were legally classified as property. This was not a secret. It was not, in the culture of the planter class, a source of shame. It was, in the language those men used among themselves, simply the natural order of things. God had arranged the world this way. They said the Bible supported it. They said the prosperity of the South depended on it. And they said that anyone who disagreed was either a fool, a fanatic, or a Northerner. Categories that in the drawing rooms of Charleston were more or less interchangeable. The plantation system that sustained this world was not merely an economic arrangement. It was a total social architecture, a complete and self-reinforcing structure of power, law, custom, and violence that governed every aspect of life for everyone within it, white and black alike, enslaved and free. It determined where you could go and when. It determined what you could say and to whom. It determined what questions you were permitted to ask and what answers you were permitted to receive. It was a world built at every level on the premise that certain things should not be known. That certain truths, if allowed to circulate freely, would bring the entire structure down. This is the world into which Heron's Bluff plantation was born. And it is the world that made what happened there not just possible, but sustainable for nearly 4 decades. The plantation sat on approximately 1,400 acres in the coastal low country, roughly 30 miles inland from Charleston. The land had been in the Vance family since the 1790s, when a man named Gerald Vance had purchased it from a failed rice planter and converted it, over the following decade, into a productive cotton operation. Gerald Vance was, by the accounts of his contemporaries, a hard man. Not cruel in any spectacular way, but possessed of the particular hardness that the management of a large plantation required, a capacity for treating human beings as units of production without allowing that treatment to register as anything other than sound business practice. He died in 1818 at the age of 60, one of a fever that came on quickly and did not leave. He left Heron's Bluff to his eldest son Harland, who was 26 years old at the time of his inheritance, and who would go on to manage the plantation for the next 37 years. Harland Vance was not, by the accounts of his contemporaries, a particularly remarkable man. He was described in letters from neighboring planters as capable, methodical, and not given to excess. He attended church regularly, the same small Episcopal congregation his father had attended, in a white clapboard, building 3 miles from the plantation gates. He sat on the county agricultural board and corresponded with other planters about crop rotation and soil management with the earnest diligence of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. He was married to a woman named Elenania Nene Pratt, who came from a respected Beaufort family and who bore him 4 children, 2 of whom survived to adulthood. He kept careful accounts. He maintained his equipment. He did not drink to excess or gamble beyond his means or engage in any of the other vices that periodically destroyed men of his class and position. By every external measure, Harland Vance was exactly what he appeared to be. A prosperous, unremarkable Southern planter, living an unremarkable Southern life. But there was one thing about Harlan Vance that his neighbors found, if they thought about it at all, and most of them did not, slightly unusual. He kept a guard on one of his slave cabins. Not all the time at first. In the early years, the late 1820s, the early 1830s, it was easy to miss. A man standing near the far end of the row of cabins, leaning against the wall, smoking a pipe. You might think he was simply resting. You might think he was watching the fields. You might think he was waiting for someone. But if you came back the next day, there he was again. And the day after that. And the night after that. The cabin in question was the last one in the row, set slightly apart from the others, closer to the tree line that marked the western boundary of the plantation's cleared land. It was built the same as all the others, rough, hewn pine boards, a single window covered with oilcloth, a door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. From the outside, there was nothing to distinguish it from any of the other cabins. No markings, no visible lock, no sign of anything unusual, just a door and a man standing in front of it. The enslaved people who lived and worked at Heron's Bluff knew better than to ask about it. They had learned, in the way that people learn things in places, where asking the wrong question can cost you everything, that the cabin at the end of the row was not something to be curious about. Children who wandered too close were pulled back by their mothers without explanation, without drama, with the swift and practiced efficiency of people who have learned that the most dangerous thing a child can do is notice the wrong thing. Men who glanced at the cabin too long while walking to the fields found themselves reassigned to the worst tasks the following morning. The ditch digging, the swamp clearing, the work that broke bodies faster than anything else. The message was never spoken aloud. It did not need to be. The message was in the reassignment, in the silence, in the way that Harlan Vance's eyes moved over the plantation each morning like a man taking inventory of everything that belonged to him. The white overseers who worked at Heron's Bluff were told, when they were hired, that the cabin was used for the storage of sensitive materials, medicines perhaps, records, valuable equipment that needed to be kept secure. They were told that Mr. Vance kept a man there as a precaution against theft, which was a common enough concern on a working plantation. Most of them accepted this explanation without question. A few did not. A few noticed things that did not quite add up, heard sounds that did not quite fit the explanation. But they had learned, too, that at Heron's Bluff there were questions that Mr. Vance did not answer. And Mr. Vance was the one who signed their wages. For nearly 2 decades, this arrangement continued without incident. The guard changed. Sometimes it was a white overseer, sometimes a trusted enslaved man who had been given a small measure of authority in exchange for his absolute compliance. But the post was never empty, not once, not for a single night. And then, in the spring of 1843, a man named Thomas Aldridge arrived at Heron's Bluff, and everything began, slowly and then all at once, to unravel. Thomas Aldridge came to Heron's Bluff as a new overseer, hired after the previous man, a Mr. Fenton, who had worked the plantation for 6 years, left suddenly and without explanation in February of 1843. Fenton had given no notice. He had simply packed his belongings one morning, collected what wages were owed to him, and left. He did not say where he was going. He did not say why he was leaving. He did not, in the years that followed, maintain any correspondence with anyone at Heron's Bluff or in the surrounding county. He disappeared from the record as completely as if he had never existed. Aldridge was 31 years old, originally from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and had spent the previous 6 years working on tobacco plantations in the Piedmont region, before moving south in search of better wages, and what he described in his letters as a change of scenery. He was a practical man. He said this of himself often enough that it is worth noting, because practical men, in his experience, did not ask questions that did not have practical answers. He had no particular feelings about the institution of slavery one way or another, which was, in the antebellum South, a perfectly ordinary position for a man of his class and occupation. He was there to do a job. The job was to manage the labor of the plantation's enslaved workers, ensure the crop was planted and harvested on schedule, maintain the equipment, and keep the accounts. Everything else was not his concern. He arrived at Heron's Bluff on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the air still carried the last cool edge of winter, and the cotton fields lay bare and brown. Waiting for the season, Harland Vance met him at the main house, a 2-story structure of white, painted wood with a wide veranda running along the front. Handsome, but not ostentatious. The house of a man who was comfortable but not showy. Vance showed him around the property with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The fields, the gin house, the barn, the tool sheds, the overseer's quarters where Aldridge would live. He explained the work schedule, the quotas, the rules. He introduced him to the other overseer, a man named Garrett, who had been at Heron's Bluff for 3 years, and who carried the particular quality of stillness that Aldridge had learned to associate with men who had seen things they had decided not to think about. It was a thorough orientation. Thorough in almost every respect. When they reached the far end of the slave quarters, a row of 8 cabins arranged in a line, each one identical to the others, except for the small variations that the people living in them had introduced over the years. A flower box here, a carved piece of wood above a door there. Aldridge noticed the man standing near the last cabin. He was a heavyset enslaved man named Cato, perhaps 40 years old, with arms crossed and eyes fixed on the middle distance, with the particular quality of attention that suggested he was not resting, but working. Standing there was his work. Aldridge asked the natural question, "What's being kept in there?" Harland Vance did not break stride. He did not look at the cabin. He did not look at Cato. He said simply, and without any particular emphasis, "That's not your concern, Mr. Aldridge. Your concern is the fields and the people who work them. That cabin is mine." Aldridge noted the response in his letter that evening. He wrote that Vance said it the way a man says something he has said many times before. Not angry, not nervous, not defensive. Just final. Like a door closing on a room you were not invited into, he let it go. He had a job to do, and the job had nothing to do with whatever was in that cabin. He threw himself into the work of the spring planting, the preparation of the fields, the distribution of seed, the management of the labor gangs, the endless logistical complexity of running a 1,400-acre cotton operation. He learned the rhythms of the plantation, got to know the other overseer, began to understand the particular personalities and capabilities of the enslaved workers under his supervision. He was, by all accounts, competent and not unnecessarily cruel, a distinction that mattered more than it should have in that time and place. But that mattered nonetheless. But the cabin stayed in the back of his mind. It was not just the guard that bothered him, though the guard was strange enough. It was the sounds. He heard them for the first time about 3 weeks after his arrival, on a warm April night when he was walking back to the overseer's quarters after a late check of the livestock. The night was clear and still, the kind of night when sound carries farther than it should, when the ordinary noises of a sleeping plantation, the creak of wood settling, the distant call of a night bird, the movement of animals in the barn, seem amplified and strange. He was passing the far end of the slave row when he heard it. A sound from inside the last cabin. Not a cry, not a voice, not anything he could immediately identify and file away under a familiar category. Something lower than any of those things, and more rhythmic. A sound like someone rocking. The slow, repetitive creak of weight shifting back and forth, in a very small space. Regular as a clock, patient as water, he stopped walking. The man on guard that night, a different man from Cato, younger, with a face that gave nothing away, looked at him without expression. Not alarm, not curiosity, just the flat, practiced blankness of someone who has been told many times and in many ways that their job is to stand here and notice nothing. Aldridge said nothing. He walked on. But he heard it again the following week and the week after that. Always at night, always the same rhythm. That slow, repetitive motion, like something wearing a groove into the floor of a space too small to pace in, too confining to do anything in except rock. Back and forth, back and forth. The sound of a creature that has found the only motion available to it, and repeated it until the motion became the creature. He began to pay closer attention to the guard rotation. He noticed that the men assigned to watch the cabin were never the same 2 nights running. A deliberate policy, he eventually concluded, designed to prevent any single person from accumulating too much knowledge of what the post entailed. He noticed that they were always among the most trusted workers on the plantation, and men who had demonstrated over years of careful observation by Harlan Vance an absolute capacity for silence. He noticed that when the guard changed at dawn, the outgoing man never spoke to the incoming one. They simply exchanged a look that Aldridge, watching from a distance, could not read, but that clearly communicated something. And the first man walked away without glancing back. He noticed, too, that Harlan Vance visited the cabin himself, alone, approximately once a week, always in the early morning, before the rest of the plantation was fully awake. He would go in, stay for perhaps 20 minutes, and come out again. His expression when he emerged was always the same. Not troubled, not relieved, not guilty, not satisfied. Simply blank. The face of a man who has done something he considers necessary and has long since stopped permitting himself to feel anything about it. By June of 1843, Thomas Aldridge had been at Heron's Bluff for 3 months, and he had come to a conclusion he was not entirely comfortable with. Whatever was in that cabin was alive. The history of Heron's Bluff, as Aldridge would eventually piece together through months of careful, patient, and extremely cautious conversation with the people who had lived there longest, was not the history that Harlan Vance presented to the world. The official history was simple and clean. Gerald Vance had built the plantation. Harlan had inherited it, and for 30 years it had operated as a prosperous cotton operation. The records were in order. The accounts were balanced. The church attendance was regular. The agricultural board meetings were attended. The neighbors were cordial. Everything was exactly as it should be. The real history was something else entirely. It began, as best as Aldridge could determine, in the winter of 1821. The older workers were not certain of the exact year, only that it was shortly after Harlan Vance had taken full control of the plantation, following his father's death. In that first period, when a young man who has just inherited power is still deciding what kind of man he is going to be. That winter, something had happened that the workers referred to in the careful, coded language that enslaved people used to discuss things that could not be discussed openly, as the change. Before the change, the last cabin in the row had been occupied like all the others by a family or by several workers who shared the space. After the change, it was emptied. The people who had lived there were moved to other cabins, given no explanation, offered no choice. And then the guard began. The oldest person at Heron's Bluff, when Aldridge arrived, was a woman named Nance, believed to be somewhere between 70 and 80 years old. No one knew exactly, because the records of enslaved people's births were kept inconsistently at best and not at all at worst. She had been at the plantation since before Harlan Vance was born. She was too old to work the fields and spent her days in a rocking chair outside her cabin, shelling beans or mending cloth, or simply sitting in the particular stillness of someone who has outlived most of the things that once required her to move. She watched the world with eyes that had seen more of it than most people ever would. And she had the quality, common to very old people who have survived very difficult lives, of knowing exactly how much of what she knew she was going to share, and with whom, and when. Aldridge approached her carefully over several weeks, with small gifts. Extra food, a piece of cloth, a length of good thread. Nothing that would draw attention, nothing that could be interpreted as anything other than a small human kindness. He was not the first white man to try to extract information from an old enslaved woman through small kindnesses. And Nance was not the first old enslaved woman to recognize exactly what was happening and decide, for her own reasons, how much to give. What she gave him over the course of several conversations spread across the summer of 1843 was this. In the winter of the year she called the bad winter, the one that had come 2 or 3 years after old Mr. Gerald died, Harlan Vance had brought something to the plantation. Not someone. Something. That was the word she used, and she used it deliberately, watching his face as she said it to see how he would react. She was testing him. She was deciding in real time whether he was someone she could afford to tell the truth to. He had brought it at night, she said, in a wagon covered with canvas, arriving after dark when most of the plantation was asleep. 2 men had carried it into the last cabin. 2 men she had never seen before and never saw again. Men who had come from somewhere else and returned to somewhere else before the sun came up, and then the guard had begun. Aldridge asked her what it was. Nance looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was golden and thick, the way it gets in the Carolina low country in late summer. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was running through its repertoire with the mechanical persistence of a creature that has no concept of silence. The air smelled of heat and pine resin and the particular sweetness of the cotton fields at the end of a long day. Then she said, "I only know what I heard, and what I heard was a child." She said it quietly, without drama. The way you say something that has been sitting inside you for 20 years and has long since lost the power to shock you, though it has never lost the power to trouble you. The way you say something that you have turned over in your mind so many times that the edges have worn smooth, but the weight of it has never changed. A child. Aldridge sat with that for a moment. Then he asked the question that seemed most obvious. Whose child? Nance shook her head. That, she said, she did not know. Or perhaps she did know, and had decided that this was the piece she would not give him. He could not tell. She was a woman who had survived 80 years in a world designed to destroy her, and she had done it partly by knowing exactly how much to say and when to stop. He thanked her and walked away with more questions than he had arrived with. A child kept in a cabin guarded day and night for 20 years. He turned the facts over in his mind, looking for an explanation that made sense within the world he understood. A child born with some illness or condition that Vance wanted to hide from the community. A child who was somehow dangerous, prone to violence perhaps, or to episodes that frightened the other workers. A child who was the product of some relationship that Vance needed to conceal. A child who was, in some way he could not yet fully articulate, a threat to something Harlan Vance valued more than he valued the child. All of these explanations were possible. None of them fully satisfied him, because none of them explained the absolute, unbroken consistency of the guard. 20 years. Not a single night without someone at that door. Whatever was in that cabin, Harlan Vance was not merely hiding it. He was containing it. He was maintaining it. He was managing it with the same methodical attention he brought to every other aspect of the plantation's operation: the crop rotations, the equipment maintenance, the careful balancing of the accounts. And he was doing it in a way that suggested he was terrified not of the thing itself, but of what would happen if the world found out it existed. Thomas Aldridge was a practical man, as he had said of himself, and practical men do not generally spend their evenings constructing elaborate theories about the secrets of their employers. But the cabin had gotten under his skin in a way he could not entirely account for. And by the late summer of 1843, he had begun to do something that he knew, even as he did it, was dangerous. He had begun to watch. Not obviously, not in a way that would draw attention from Harlan Vance or from Garrett, the other overseer, who had the quality of a man who noticed things and reported them. He simply arranged his evening walks to take him past the far end of the slave row more often than strictly necessary. He noted the times of the guard changes, always at dawn, always at dusk, always conducted with that same wordless exchange of looks. He noted which men were assigned to which nights, and began to see the pattern in the rotation. Never the same man 2 nights running. Never a man who had been at the plantation for less than 5 years. Never a man who had shown any tendency toward conversation with the white overseers. He noted the frequency of Harlan Vance's visits, and whether there was any pattern to them, any correlation with events on the plantation, with the seasons, with anything he could identify. What he found, after 2 months of careful observation, was this: Harlan Vance's visits to the cabin increased whenever there was a significant disruption to the ordinary routine of the plantation. A birth, a death, a visitor from outside, the arrival of a new worker, any event that altered the normal texture of life at Heron's Bluff seemed to prompt an additional visit, sometimes 2 in a single week where before there had been only 1. This told Aldridge something important. It told him that Vance was not simply checking on a storage room or monitoring a sick animal. He was managing something that was aware of the world outside the cabin. Something that responded to changes in that world, or that Vance feared might respond to them. Something that needed to be, in some way Aldridge could not yet fully articulate, settled, reassured, or warned. In September of 1843, a man named Apprentice Vance arrived at Heron's Bluff. He was Harlan's younger brother, and he had been living in Charleston for the past decade, working in some capacity in the shipping trade. The 2 brothers were not close. That much was apparent from the stiffness of their greeting when Apprentice arrived, from the particular quality of formality that exists between people who share blood, but not warmth, and from the fact that Harlan had not mentioned his brother's impending visit to anyone on the plantation. Apprentice simply appeared one afternoon in a hired carriage with 2 trunks and an expression that suggested he had not come by choice. He stayed for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, Harlan Vance visited the last cabin every single day, sometimes twice. Aldridge watched this with great interest. On the 3rd day of Apprentice's visit, Aldridge managed to position himself near enough to the main house veranda to overhear a portion of a conversation between the 2 brothers. He was not proud of this. He noted it in his letters with a certain self-consciousness, acknowledging that it was not the behavior of a gentleman. but he heard it nonetheless. And what he heard changed the nature of his understanding of everything he had been observing. He caught only fragments. Apprentice's voice, lower and more urgent than his brother's, carrying the particular tension of a man who has been rehearsing this conversation for a long time and is not finding it going the way he rehearsed it. Cannot continue this way, Harland. It has been 20 years. People will eventually. And then Harland's voice, flat and final as a stone dropped into still water. No one will know. No one has known. And no one will. A pause. The sound of a chair moving on the wooden boards of the veranda. Then Apprentice again, quieter now, almost pleading. And when you're gone, what then? What happens when you're not here to manage it? And Harland, without hesitation, without any audible emotion at all. That is not your concern. That has never been your concern. Aldridge walked away before he could hear more. He had heard enough. 20 years. Harland had said it himself. Whatever was in that cabin had been there for 20 years. And Apprentice Vance, a man who lived 30 miles away in Charleston and had apparently been carrying the weight of this knowledge for all of those 20 years, was frightened. Not of the thing itself, but of what would happen when Harland was no longer there to contain it. He went back to Nance the following week. He told her what he had heard. He asked her again, not whose child, but what had happened to the child. Was it still alive? Nance looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was different now. September light, lower and more golden than August, carrying in it the first suggestion of the coming change. The mockingbird was gone. The air was quieter. Still there, she said finally. Still in that cabin. How do you know? Aldridge asked. She looked at him as if the question were slightly foolish. Because the guard is still there, she said. The guard stops when what's inside stops. He understood what she meant. The guard was not just a precaution. It was a signal, a living indicator. As long as the guard stood, whatever was inside was still alive. The guard was the only acknowledgement in the entire visible world of Heron's Bluff plantation that the person in that cabin existed at all, and it had been alive in that cabin for 20 years. If you are still with us, and I think you are, because this is the kind of story that does not let you go, I want to ask you something before we continue. Do you think Harland Vance believed he was doing the right thing? Or do you think he knew every single morning when he walked to that cabin exactly what he was? Leave your answer in the comments. We read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because what comes next is the part of this story that changes everything. The winter of 1843 came early to the South Carolina Low Country. By November, the fields were stripped and bare, the cotton long since ginned and baled and shipped to Charleston, and the plantation had settled into the slower rhythm of the cold months. Fence mending, tool repair, the endless maintenance that a working farm required to be ready for the following spring. The days were shorter. The nights were long and quiet and cold. The kind of cold that comes off the river and settles into everything, into the wood of the buildings and the ground beneath your feet and the spaces between your thoughts. It was in this quiet that Thomas Aldridge made his mistake. He had been at Heron's Bluff for 8 months by then. In those 8 months he had accumulated a considerable body of observation and a considerable weight of unresolved questions. He had also, without quite intending to develop something he could only describe as a compulsion. The cabin was there every day at the edge of his vision. The guard was there, and somewhere inside someone had been living in that space for 20 years in a silence so complete that the only evidence of their existence was the sound of rocking in the dark and the presence of a man standing at a door. He told himself he was going to look. Just look. Not enter, not interfere, not do anything that could be construed as a violation of his employer's property or authority. Just look through the window. The oilcloth that covered it was old and had developed a small tear in the lower left corner. He had noticed this weeks ago, had filed it away without quite knowing why. If he stood at the right angle, in the right light, he might be able to see something. He might be able to answer, once and for all, the question that had been living in the back of his mind since his first week at the plantation. He chose a night in late November when the guard was a young man named Reuben, who had a habit in the coldest hours before dawn of pulling his coat up around his ears and letting his eyes go unfocused in the way of someone fighting sleep. He waited until well past midnight, when the plantation was fully asleep, and the only sounds were the wind moving through the live oaks and the distant, mournful call of an owl somewhere in the tree line. He moved slowly, keeping to the shadows at the edge of the row, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He reached the cabin. Reuben was awake. Aldridge had miscalculated, or Reuben had been more alert than usual, or some instinct had kept the young man's eyes open on this particular night. But he was facing the other direction, looking out toward the fields, and Aldridge was able to press himself against the side wall of the cabin without being seen. He waited. 1 minute. 2. The cold was extraordinary, the kind that gets into your fingers and makes them clumsy and slow. He moved to the window. He found the tear in the oilcloth. He looked through it. The interior of the cabin was lit by a single tallow candle set on a small wooden table near the center of the room. The candle was burning low, and its light was weak and wavering, casting more shadow than illumination, turning the corners of the room into places of absolute darkness. But it was enough. The cabin was not empty. In the far corner, on a low pallet covered with a rough blanket, there was a figure. A person sitting upright, knees drawn to chest, arms wrapped around the knees, in the posture of someone who has learned that making themselves as small as possible is the safest way to exist in a given space. The figure was rocking, that slow, rhythmic motion that Aldridge had heard on so many nights, back and forth, back and forth. The motion of someone for whom movement has become the only available response to the fact of being alive. He could not see the face clearly. The figure was turned slightly away from him, toward the wall, toward the darkness in the corner that the candle's light could not reach. But he could see enough to understand several things at once. Things that came to him not in sequence but altogether, like a hand pressed flat against his chest. The figure was an adult, or something close to it. The proportions were those of a grown person, not a child. The shoulders were broad. The legs folded against the chest were long. But the posture, the rocking, the way the arms clutched the knees, these were not the postures of an adult. They were the postures of a child. A child who had never been given the space, the experience, the human contact necessary to grow into anything else. The figure was dressed in plain, clean clothing, not rags, not the clothing of someone who had been neglected in the physical sense. Someone had been caring for this person, feeding them, clothing them, maintaining them in a state of basic physical adequacy. This was not neglect in the conventional sense. This was something more deliberate, and in its own way more disturbing than neglect. This was maintenance, the careful, methodical maintenance of something that needed to be kept alive, but did not need to be allowed to live. And then the figure stopped rocking. The stillness was sudden and complete, like a clock stopping. One moment the motion was there, regular and rhythmic, and the next it was simply gone. And in the silence that followed, the figure slowly, very slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has learned that sudden movements bring consequences, turned its head toward the window. Aldridge pulled back before he could see the face. He pressed himself against the wall of the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that seemed impossible to contain. Certain that he had been seen, certain that Reuben would turn around, certain that everything was about to collapse into something he could not control. He stood there for what felt like a very long time, not breathing, not moving, listening. Nothing happened. After several minutes, he could not have said how many, he heard the rocking begin again. Slow, rhythmic, endless. The sound of someone returning to the only motion they knew. He walked back to the overseer's quarters in the dark and did not sleep that night. He lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about what he had seen, turning it over and over in his mind, the way you turn a stone over in your hand, when you are not sure what it is, but you are sure that it matters. An adult with the posture of a child, kept in a cabin guarded day and night for 20 years. He thought about Nance's words. The guard stops when what's inside stops. He thought about Apprentice Vance's voice on the veranda, carrying that particular quality of a man who has been frightened for a long time and has learned to live with the fear, but has never learned to stop feeling it. He thought about Harlan Vance's face when he emerged from his weekly visits. That blank, deliberate emptiness, the face of a man who has decided that feeling nothing is the only sustainable response to what he has done. And he thought about the figure in the corner, rocking in the candlelight, and the way it had stopped and turned its head toward the window, with the slow and patient attention of something that has been waiting for a very long time for someone to look. The next morning, he made a decision that would change everything. He wrote a letter. Not to Harlan Vance. Not to anyone in the county. Not to anyone whose first instinct upon receiving such a letter would be to protect the man who signed their wages or the system that kept them comfortable. He wrote to a man named Reverend Clement Oakes, who ran a small Methodist congregation in a town called Millahaven, about 20 miles north of Heron's Bluff, and who had a reputation, carefully cultivated and carefully guarded, in the way that such reputations had to be in South Carolina in 1843, as a man who could be trusted with difficult information. Oakes was not an abolitionist, not openly, not in South Carolina, where such a position was not merely unpopular, but actively dangerous, where men had been run out of towns, had their property destroyed, had been subjected to violence for expressing views that, in other parts of the country, were merely controversial. But he was known, among those who knew such things, as a man who believed that certain things were wrong regardless of what the law said about them. A man who had on more than one occasion found ways to do things that the law did not sanction without ever quite doing anything that the law could prosecute. Aldridge did not tell Oakes everything in the letter. He told him enough. He described the cabin, the guard, the figure he had seen through the window. He described what Nance had told him. He described the conversation he had overheard between the Vance brothers. He described the pattern of Harlan Vance's visits and what that pattern suggested about the nature of what was being kept inside. He sealed the letter carefully with wax and gave it to a traveling merchant who passed through the plantation in early December, asking him to deliver it to Oakes's church in Millhaven. He gave the merchant a small amount of money, enough to ensure the delivery, not enough to make it memorable. Then he waited. He waited through December and into January. He continued his work. He continued his observations. He noticed in those weeks that Harlan Vance seemed slightly more watchful than usual, his eyes moving over the plantation each morning with a quality of attention subtly different from his ordinary survey, as if he were looking not for problems in the operation of the plantation, but for something else. Something that might be out of place, something that might have shifted. Aldridge was careful to give him nothing. In late January of 1844, Reverend Oakes arrived at Heron's Bluff. He came under the pretext of a pastoral visit. He was known to make occasional rounds of the plantations in the area, offering religious services to the enslaved workers, a practice that most planters tolerated as a useful tool for maintaining order and compliance. Harlan Vance received him politely, offered him dinner, and gave him permission to hold a brief service in the slave quarters the following morning. It was a perfectly ordinary visit of the kind that happened at plantations across the county several times a year. Aldridge managed to speak with Oakes for approximately 4 minutes in a corner of the barn, while the horses were being watered and Garrett was occupied on the other side of the property. 4 minutes was not long, but Oakes was a man who had learned to communicate a great deal in a very short time. He had done some investigation of his own in the weeks since receiving Aldridge's letter. He had spoken, carefully and indirectly, to people who had connections to Heron's Bluff. Former workers who had been sold or hired out to other plantations. Merchants who traded regularly with the Vance operation. A physician in Charleston who had been called out to the property on several occasions over the years. What he had found was fragmentary and incomplete, assembled from pieces that no single person had been willing to provide in their entirety. But the pieces, when you put them together, pointed in a direction that made Aldridge's blood run cold. There had been a child born at Heron's Bluff in the winter of 1821. The child had been born to an enslaved woman named Dilcia, who had died shortly after the birth. Of complications, the record said, though the record was sparse and the details were vague in the way that records of enslaved people's deaths tended to be vague, as if the specifics were not considered worth preserving. The child had survived, and the child's father, according to the whispers that Oakes had collected from people who had been at the plantation in those years and had since moved on, was Harlan Vance himself. This was not, in the antebellum South, an unusual situation. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women by their enslavers was so common as to be almost unremarkable, and the children produced by such relationships occupied a deeply uncomfortable position in the social order. Legally enslaved like their mothers, but carrying the blood of the white planter class in a society built on the absolute, non-negotiable separation of those two categories. Such children existed everywhere in the South. They were sold, hired out, sent away, ignored, occasionally acknowledged in private while being denied in public. The system had 100 ways of managing them, all of them designed to make the inconvenient truth of their existence disappear into the machinery of the institution. What was unusual, what was in fact extraordinary, was what Harlan Vance had done next. The child, according to Oakes's information, had been born with a physical appearance that made it impossible to conceal what it was, or rather, who its father was. The resemblance, by all accounts, was unmistakable. Not the kind of resemblance that could be explained away or politely ignored. The kind of resemblance that, in a world built on the pretense that certain things did not happen, was simply intolerable. And so Harlan Vance had made a decision. He had not sold the child. He had not sent it away to another state, another county, another plantation, where no one would know its history. He had not done any of the things that planters in his position typically did to resolve such inconveniences. Instead, he had put the child in a cabin and posted a guard and kept it there, hidden from the world, for 20 years. Why? Oakes had a theory. And it was a theory that Aldrich found, when he heard it, both entirely plausible and deeply disturbing in its very plausibility, in the way that it required no monsters, no extraordinary evil, only the ordinary calculations of a man protecting what he valued most. Elenaniad Moats, Harlan's wife, came from a family that was, by the standards of the South Carolina planter class, considerably more prominent than the Vances. Her father had been a state legislator. Her brother was a judge in Beaufort County. The Pratt family's social standing was, in the careful arithmetic of that world, a significant asset to Harlan Vance, one that had opened doors, smoothed transactions, and provided a layer of social protection that a man of his moderate origins could not have achieved on his own. It was an asset he could not afford to lose. And Elenania Vance was, by all accounts, not a woman who would have tolerated the existence of such a child. Not the existence of it, not the knowledge of it, not the possibility that anyone might see it and draw the obvious conclusion about what it meant and who was responsible for it. She was a woman of her class and her time, which meant she had been trained from childhood to maintain a particular fiction about the world she lived in. A fiction that required, above all else, that certain things not be seen. So Harlan Vance had hidden it, not to protect the child, not out of any feeling for the child at all, to protect himself, to protect his marriage, his social standing, his position in the community, his relationship with the Pratt family, his seat on the agricultural board, his pew in the Episcopal Church. The child was not a person to be cared for. It was a problem to be managed, and for 20 years, he had managed it with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. The guard was not there to protect the child from the world. It was there to protect the world from knowing the child existed. The spring of 1844 came to Heron's Bluff with a warmth that felt to Thomas Aldrich almost indecent. The azaleas blooming in extravagant pink and white along the main drive. The fields greening up with the first shoots of the new cotton crop, the air carrying that particular sweetness of things growing in rich soil after a cold winter. It was the kind of spring that made you believe, if you were not paying attention, that the world was a fundamentally decent place. That things grew and bloomed and renewed themselves, and that this was the essential truth of existence. Aldrich was paying attention. He and Reverend Oakes had spent the intervening months in careful, clandestine correspondence. Letters written in language deliberately vague enough to be innocuous if intercepted, but clear enough between two men who understood what they were discussing. Oakes had made contact with several people in Charleston, a lawyer named Harrow, who had a reputation for taking cases that other lawyers declined, a physician named Dr. Ansel Webb, who had trained in Philadelphia and had views about human dignity that were not entirely compatible with the world he had chosen to practice in, and a woman whose name Aldrich was never told, but who was described to him as someone with connections to networks that moved people and information across the South in ways that the law did not sanction and the authorities did not officially acknowledge. Together, over those winter months, they had constructed a plan. The plan was not dramatic. It was not a rescue in the conventional sense. There was no possibility of simply removing the person from the cabin without consequences that would fall most heavily on the enslaved people at Heron's Bluff, who had nothing to do with any of it. The law was clear, and the law was enforced, and the law was not on their side. What Oakes and his associates had determined, after considerable deliberation, was that the most effective course of action available to them within the constraints of that time and place and legal system was documentation. If the existence of this person could be established in writing, if there were witnesses, records, testimony from credible parties. Then the secret that Harland Vance had maintained for 20 years would become something that could not simply be made to disappear. It would exist in the world in a form the world could not ignore. It would be a fact. And facts, even in a world designed to suppress them, have a way of persisting. This was, Aldridge understood, a limited and imperfect solution. It would not undo 20 years. It would not restore what had been taken. It would not give back the childhood, the language, the human contact, the simple experience of existing in the world as a person rather than a secret. But it was what was possible, and possible, in that time and place, was not nothing. In April of 1844, Reverend Oakes arrived at Heron's Bluff for a second pastoral visit. He brought with him, as part of his traveling party, a man he introduced as his assistant. A quiet, unremarkable-looking man named Webb, who was, in fact, the physician from Charleston. The visit was arranged to coincide with a day when Harland Vance was away from the plantation. He had traveled to Charleston for a meeting of the County Agricultural Board, a trip that Aldridge had known about for 2 weeks and had communicated to Oakes in advance. Elenania Vance was at home, but occupied with a visit from her sister, a woman from Beaufort who came twice a year and whose visits consumed Elenania's attention entirely. The other overseer, Garrett, was occupied with a fence repair on the far side of the property that Aldridge had arranged to keep him busy. For the better part of the day, everything was in place. Aldridge led Oakes and Webb to the far end of the slave quarters in the mid-morning, when the light was clear and the air was warm and the rest of the plantation was occupied with its ordinary work. The guard that day was Cato, the same man who had been standing there on Aldridge's first day at the plantation more than a year earlier. Cato looked at the 3 men approaching and said nothing. His face was unreadable. His arms were crossed. He stood in front of the door the way he had stood in front of it every day for years, with the patience of someone who has made his peace with his assignment. Aldridge stopped in front of him. He looked at Cato directly, not over his shoulder, not at the cabin, but at Cato's face. And he spoke to him as one man speaks to another, which was not the ordinary mode of address between an overseer and an enslaved man at a plantation in South Carolina in 1844, and which Cato registered with a slight shift of his eyes that might have been surprise. Aldridge told him what he knew. He told him what he and Oakes were trying to do. He told him that no one at the plantation would be harmed by what happened next, that the purpose of this visit was not to take anything, or destroy anything, or expose anyone who did not deserve to be exposed. He told him that if Cato chose not to step aside, they would leave. He would understand. And there would be no consequences. Cato stood very still for a long moment. The morning light came through the live oaks at the edge of the tree line and made patterns on the ground between them. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker was working at a dead pine with methodical persistence. Then Cato stepped to one side. The door of the cabin was not locked. It opened inward on those slightly crooked hinges with a sound like a long exhalation, the sound of something that has been held closed for a very long time, finally being allowed to open. The interior was dim. The oilcloth over the window admitted only a thin gray light, and the air inside was close and warm, carrying the smell of tallow and wood smoke and something else. Something harder to name, the particular smell of a space that has been lived in for a very long time by someone who has had nowhere else to go. The smell of a life contained. In the corner on the pallet, the figure sat. The rocking had stopped. The figure was looking at the door with the expression of someone who has heard the sound of that door opening many times before and has learned to wait very still to see what the opening means. Dr. Webb stepped forward. He spoke quietly, in a tone that Aldridge would later describe in his letters as the most careful and deliberate he had ever heard from another human being. Each word placed with the precision of someone who understands that the wrong word in this moment could shatter something that cannot be put back together. He spoke slowly. He kept his hands visible. He did not move quickly. He did not raise his voice. What Webb found, and what he documented in a written account that he sealed and deposited with the lawyer in Charleston that same evening, was this. The person in the cabin was a young man. He was approximately 22 or 23 years old, based on Webb's medical assessment of his physical development. He was in reasonable physical health. He had been fed, clothed, and kept warm in the minimal sense that those words implied. He had not been subjected to the kind of physical deprivation that leaves visible marks on a body. Someone had maintained him in the way that you maintain something you cannot afford to lose, but do not know what to do with. He had received no education. He could not read. He could not write. He had had no sustained human contact beyond the weekly visits of Harlan Vance, visits that Webb, based on Aldridge's descriptions, concluded were not visits of any warmth or human connection, but rather inspections. The kind of check that a man makes on something he is responsible for keeping alive. And the silent presence of the guards outside his door. He had spent his entire conscious life, from earliest memory, in that cabin. He did not speak, not because he was unable to. Webb determined through careful examination that there was no physical impediment to speech. He did not speak because he had had no one to speak to. He had had no language modeled for him in any sustained way. No conversation, no human exchange of any kind beyond the most basic and functional. He communicated in sounds and gestures, in the way that a person communicates when language has never been given to them as a tool, when the words that other people use to navigate the world have never been made available. He was, in the most precise and devastating sense of the phrase, a person who had been kept from becoming a person. Webb also documented what Oakes had suspected and what Aldridge had begun to understand. The young man's physical appearance made the question of his parentage unmistakable. He bore a resemblance to Harlan Vance that was, in Webb's clinical language, striking and unambiguous. The same jaw, the same set of the eyes, the same particular shape of the brow that appeared in the portrait of Harlan Vance hanging in the main house of Heron's Bluff plantation. Harlan Vance had looked at his own son 22 years earlier and had decided that the most convenient thing to do with him was to make him disappear, not to kill him. Vance was not apparently capable of that, or perhaps simply unwilling to carry that particular weight, but to erase him, to keep him in a space between existence and non-existence, alive but unknown, present but invisible, breathing and eating and rocking in the dark. A secret so well kept that even the people who guarded him had been trained over years not to think of him as a person. The document that Webb prepared that afternoon was 8 pages long. It described the young man's physical condition, his approximate age, his apparent cognitive and developmental state, and the circumstances of his confinement. It named Harlan Vance as the person responsible for that confinement. It was signed by Webb, witnessed by Oakes, and countersigned by Thomas Aldridge. Cado, who had watched the entire examination from the doorway with the stillness of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time and is not entirely sure how to feel now that it has arrived, was asked if he would add his mark to the document. He looked at it for a long time. Then he made his mark. A single line crossed by another, pressed into the paper with a deliberateness that suggested he understood exactly what he was doing, and had decided, after a lifetime of being required to understand nothing, that this was worth understanding. What happened next did not happen quickly, and it did not happen cleanly. Because nothing in that world happened quickly or cleanly when it involved the exposure of a powerful man's secrets. The machinery of concealment that Harlan Vance had built over 20 years did not dismantle itself overnight. It came apart slowly, piece by piece, in the way that things built on a false foundation eventually come apart. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with a gradual, inexorable settling. The document that Webb had deposited with the Charleston lawyer was not, in the legal framework of 1844 South Carolina, a weapon with obvious or immediate effect. The young man in the cabin was legally enslaved property. His confinement, however disturbing, was not a crime that the courts of South Carolina were prepared to prosecute. The state's legal system was not designed to protect people in his position. It was designed, at every level, to protect people in Harlan Vance's position. The law was clear about this. The law had been made clear about this deliberately and repeatedly by men very much like Harlan Vance. But Reverend Oakes was a patient man, and he understood that the law was not the only instrument available to him. He began, carefully and selectively, to share the contents of the document with people whose opinions mattered in the world that Harlan Vance inhabited. Not publicly, not in a way that could be traced back to him, or to Aldridge, or to Webb, but in the quiet, persistent way that information moves through a community when someone is determined that it should move. A word here, a letter there, a carefully worded conversation over dinner with someone who would tell someone else, who would tell someone else, who would eventually tell someone whose opinion Harlan Vance could not afford to ignore. By the summer of 1844, there were people in Charleston who knew. Not everything, not the document, not the specifics, not the name of the physician or the overseer who had been inside the cabin. But enough. Enough to make certain conversations awkward. Enough to make certain invitations stop arriving at the Vance household. Enough to make Elenania Vance's brother, the judge from Beaufort County, pay a visit to Heron's Bluff in July of that year that lasted for 3 hours and left Harlan Vance visibly shaken in a way that Aldridge, watching from a distance, had never seen him shaken before. The judge left without staying for dinner. He did not return. Thomas Aldridge left Heron's Bluff in August of 1844. He gave his notice properly, citing a desire to return to Virginia, and Harlan Vance accepted it without comment. They shook hands at the door of the main house on a warm August morning. With the smell of the fields in the air and the sound of the plantation at work in the background, Harlan Vance looked at him for a moment with an expression that Aldridge could not entirely read. Not anger, not accusation, not the open hostility of a man who knows he has been betrayed. Something more complicated than any of those things. Something that might have been, in a different man in a different life, the beginning of shame. Or perhaps it was simply the expression of a man who has understood for the first time that a secret he has maintained for 20 years is no longer entirely his. That it has escaped the cabin in some form and is moving through the world in ways he cannot control. Aldridge wrote about that handshake in his final letter from Heron's Bluff. He wrote, he knows. I don't know how he knows, or how much he knows, or what he intends to do about it. But he knows that something has changed. The secret is still a secret in the sense that it has not been spoken aloud in any public forum, has not appeared in any newspaper, has not been the subject of any legal proceeding. But it is no longer entirely his, and I think he understands, in the way that a man understands something he would prefer not to understand, that it will never be entirely his again. What happened to the young man in the cabin is the part of this story that is hardest to tell, because the records are incomplete and the truth is uncertain. And because the uncertainty itself is a kind of answer, a testament to how thoroughly a person can be erased from the record of the world, when the people responsible for erasing him have sufficient power and sufficient motivation. What is known is this. In the fall of 1845, approximately a year after Aldridge's departure, the guard at the last cabin at Heron's Bluff stopped. The post that had been maintained without interruption for nearly 25 years was simply discontinued. The man who had been standing there was reassigned. The cabin stood empty for several months, its door hanging slightly open on those crooked hinges, the oilcloth on the window moving in the breeze. Then it was used for storage, as Harland Vance had always claimed it was used. What happened to the young man between the spring of 1844 and the fall of 1845 is not documented in any record that has been found. Whether he was moved to another location, another plantation, another county, another state, whether he was given some measure of freedom that the records do not reflect, whether he survived at all, none of this is known with certainty. The document that Webb prepared exists. The lawyer in Charleston who received it exists in the records. But the young man himself, the person at the center of everything, disappears from the record as completely as if he had never been there. Which was, of course, exactly what Harland Vance had always intended. What is known is that Harland Vance's position in the community changed, gradually and then more rapidly, in the years following 1844. The invitations did slow. The social connections did thin. The agricultural board meetings were attended less regularly. Elenania Vance's family maintained a distance from Heron's Bluff that had not existed before. A distance that was never explained and never acknowledged, but that was felt by everyone who paid attention to such things. Vance himself became, by the accounts of his neighbors, increasingly withdrawn, less present at community events, less engaged with the world around him, less visible in the public life of the county that once been his natural habitat. He died in 1857 at the age of 65, of what was recorded as a fever. He left Heron's Bluff to his surviving son, who sold it within 2 years. The plantation changed hands several times in the following decades, and by the time of the Civil War, it had been subdivided and partially abandoned, the fields reverting to scrub and the buildings falling into disrepair with the particular speed of structures that no one has any reason to maintain. The last cabin in the row, the one with the crooked door and the oilcloth window, the one that had been guarded for 25 years, burned down sometime in the 1870s. Whether the fire was accidental or deliberate, no one recorded. By then, there was no one left at Heron's Bluff who remembered what the cabin had contained, or who had been willing to stand guard at its door through all those years of cold nights and long summers. Or if they remembered, they had decided, as people so often decide in the aftermath of terrible things, that remembering was not worth the cost. Reverend Oakes continued his ministry until his death in 1861, 2 months after the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter, 30 miles from where he had spent his life. Among his papers, found by his congregation after his passing, was a sealed envelope containing a copy of Dr. Webb's document. The envelope was labeled in Oakes's careful handwriting for the record. In the event that anyone should ever wish to know, Thomas Aldridge returned to Virginia and spent the rest of his working life as a farm manager on a tobacco operation in the Shenandoah Valley. He never returned to South Carolina. He never spoke publicly about what he had seen at Heron's Bluff. His letters, The ones that formed the primary source for this account were found among the effects of his granddaughter, who donated them to a small historical society in the 1920s, where they sat in an archive box, largely unread, for the better part of a century. Cato, who had stepped aside from the door of the cabin on that April morning in 1844, was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. He was by then somewhere in his 50s. What became of him after that? Where he went, whether he had family, whether he built any kind of life in the years that followed, is not known. He appears in the record once more, in a Freedmen's Bureau document from 1865, listed among the formerly enslaved people of the Herons Bluff area. After that, nothing. And the young man, the one who had spent his entire life in a space 12 feet by 14 feet, who had never learned to speak in any language, who had never seen the fields or the river or the live oaks draped in Spanish moss, who had never felt rain on his face or heard music or sat at a table with other people and shared a meal, who had been kept alive and kept hidden and kept from becoming a person for 22 years. His name, if he ever had one, does not appear in any document that has survived. He was the secret that Harlan Vance kept. He was the reason the guard never left. He was the thing that the plantation's entire social machinery had been bent, for a quarter of a century, toward concealing. He was a person who had been reduced to a problem, and then to a secret, and then to a sound in the dark. That slow, rhythmic rocking that Thomas Aldridge had heard on so many nights. The sound of someone who had found the only motion available to them and repeated it until the motion became the only thing they were. In the end, the most disturbing thing about his story is not what was done to him. It is how easy it was to do it. How ordinary the mechanisms of concealment were. How many people knew or suspected or heard the rocking in the dark, and chose not to ask what it meant. How a man could maintain such a secret for 25 years in the middle of a working plantation, surrounded by hundreds of people, simply by making the cost of curiosity high enough that no one was willing to pay it. The cabin is gone now. The plantation is gone. The fields have long since been reclaimed by the low country forest, the live oaks and the sweet gum, and the palmetto moving back over the land with the patient indifference of things that were there before and will be there long after. The road that once led to the main house is overgrown. The gin house is a memory. The veranda where Harlan Vance sat and told his brother that no one would ever know. That veranda is gone too, returned to the earth it was built on. But somewhere in the archive of a small historical society, in a box that is rarely opened and almost never requested, there is a collection of letters written by a man named Thomas Aldridge in the years between 1843 and 1844. And among those letters, carefully preserved in the way that things are sometimes preserved, not because anyone intended to preserve them, but simply because no one got around to destroying them, there is a description of a night in late November when a man pressed his eye to a tear in an oilcloth window and saw, in the wavering light of a tallow candle, a figure rocking in the corner of a room that was 12 feet by 14 feet, and had been that figure's entire world for 20 years. And in a lawyer's office in Charleston, in records that were transferred to a state archive sometime in the early 20th century and have been cataloged, but not widely studied, there is an 8-page document in a physician's careful hand. At the bottom of the last page, next to the signatures of 3 men who decided that something should not be allowed to simply disappear, there is a mark, a single line crossed by another, pressed into the paper with a deliberateness that suggested the man who made it understood exactly what he was doing, and had decided, after a lifetime of being required to understand nothing, that this was worth understanding. That mark is the only record that any of them were ever there. That mark is the only record that he was ever there. If this story stayed with you, if you are sitting with that weight right now, turning it over in your mind, the way Aldridge turned it over on that November night, then you already understand why we tell stories like this one. Not to frighten, not to shock, but because some things deserve to be remembered, even when, especially when, someone worked very hard to make sure they would be forgotten. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you think happened to him. Tell us where you are listening from. Tell us if you believe this story is real. Because that question, that uncertainty is exactly the point. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And we will see you in the next one.